All right, let's jump right in. We're living in 2026, and the battle for our attention, it's never been more intense. So today, we're going to dig into a really powerful psychological framework that's become absolutely essential for navigating this crazy world. And it all kicks off with one very specific and pretty complex question.
Okay, so let's really dive into this. This question is sitting right at the edge of what we know about cognitive science. We're talking about minds that just work differently. The 3D visual thinker, or someone with hyperthymesia, that's that near-perfect memory of your own life. Or even a twice-exceptional person, someone who's both incredibly gifted and has a learning disability. So the big question is, how do these super unique brains experience something like cognitive decline? It's a really fascinating puzzle, right?
And honestly, the answer might surprise you. As of right now, the simple, direct answer is no. Yeah, no. Researchers just aren't systematically studying this exact intersection, at least not yet. It's basically wide open territory. But hold on, don't worry, that's not the end of our story, not by a long shot. In fact, it's the beginning.
Because the thing is, just asking how we would even begin to tackle that question, well, that leads us straight to the core idea we're talking about today. It's a foundational theory that gives us the tools to understand not just these incredible, unique cases, but our own minds every single day.
And that big idea? It's called cognitive load theory. The best way to think about it is like, it's the operating manual for your brain's bandwidth. That limited resource you're using right now to learn, to create, to just focus in a world that feels like it's designed to overwhelm you.
So what is it really? Well, it was developed by a guy named John Sweller, and the whole theory is built on one simple but really powerful truth. Your working memory, that's the part of your brain juggling all the new stuff, is shockingly small. Seriously, it has a tiny, limited capacity, and literally everything you try to learn has to squeeze through this one little bottleneck.
Okay, this table breaks down all that mental strain into three main types. So, imagine your working memory is like a tiny workbench. First up, you've got intrinsic load. This is just how hard the task is, like trying to assemble a really complex engine. It is what it is. Then, you've got extraneous load. This is all the useless junk cluttering up your workbench. Terrible instructions, your phone buzzing, all that noise. The goal here is to minimize it, get it out of the way. And finally, there's germane load. This is the good stuff. This is the focused effort of actually building the engine and really understanding how it works. So our goal is always to clear away the clutter so we can maximize our brain power for this deep, meaningful learning.
And this idea isn't new. It's been evolving for decades. Sweller actually came up with it way back in the late 80s. He was trying to fix these discovery learning methods, where you just throw his students in the deep end and hope they'd figure it out. Spoilers, they usually just got overloaded. Fast forward to 2019, and the theory gets a big update with an evolutionary perspective. And now, here in 2026, it's the essential framework for everything. From designing smart AI tutors to just helping us survive the non-stop barrage of digital notification.
So yeah, let's talk about that. Why on earth is a theory from the 1980s more relevant today than ever before? Simple. Because the world we live in now is a masterclass in generating that extraneous cognitive load. All that useless mental noise. We are, all of us, in a constant fight for our own focus.
Okay, so in 2026, the theory really stands on these four pillars. First, there's digital distraction management. This is the science that finally explains why multitasking feels so draining. Then you've got AI-enhanced learning. This theory is the engine behind all those cool tools that can personalize how hard content is for you in real time. Third, evolutionary psychology. This helps us understand why we learn to speak almost automatically, but have to really struggle to learn algebra. One is biologically primary, the other not so much. And finally, multimedia design. It's still the absolute gold standard for creating presentations and videos that actually work, that don't just overwhelm you.
And this field is anything but static. It's constantly evolving. You've got researchers today pushing the theory in all these fascinating new directions. So on one side, you have people like Sweller and Hazen Liron, who really focused on how educators can control the learning environment to stop overload before it starts. Then you have researchers like Nadia Elbawab. She sees distraction differently, not as the problem itself, but as a symptom of being overloaded. And she's exploring how groups can work together to share that mental load. And then there's this other cool idea from Rolf Herdwick, who basically says, hey, maybe these cognitive limits aren't a flaw at all, but an evolutionary feature that helps us make quick, good enough decisions.
Let's zoom in on some of this for a second. Batel Hazen Liron's work is it's so important. She's the one who's actually proven in labs how even tiny things like a messy web page layout or just too many colors, which she calls task-irrelevant information, how that stuff creates real mental interference.
So she's the one giving us the hard data that shows a clean, focused digital space isn't just a nice to have, it's a cognitive necessity.
And then there's Nadia Elbawab, who is tackling our modern attention crisis head on. You know that feeling when your brain is just fried and you find yourself endlessly scrolling on your phone? Well, her research shows exactly why. When our cognitive load gets too high, our brain basically looks for an escape hatch. And that's usually it. But what's really cool is she also developed this idea of collaborative cognitive load theory. She suggests a team can act like one big, collective working memory. But, and this is a huge but, it only works if the effort of just talking to each other doesn't create its own massive cognitive load.
Okay, so we've got the theory down. That's the what. Now, what about the so what? How do we actually apply this stuff? Let's look at a pretty radical but really practical application. This idea of actively pruning your own mental inputs to get to peak performance. And this whole thing kicks off with a super provocative quote from a neuroscientist named Dinis Verhage. He said, "Losing the loser neurons and loser people." Whoa, right? I know it sounds incredibly harsh, but stick with me because there's some really fascinating science behind this idea of strategic pruning.
So what on earth are loser neurons? Well, they're not really losers, of course. It's a term for specific brain cells that can get you stuck in these rigid reactive loops, especially after you've failed at something. You know that feeling. So pruning them just means breaking up those inflexible circuits. It lets your brain recalibrate and adapt. And this whole process is super important for freeing up a part of your brain called the orbitofrontal cortex, which is basically the command center for integrating complex ideas and making good decisions.
So you can actually translate this idea into a pretty straightforward three-step process. Step one is to identify. Just recognize the things, the thoughts in your head, the people you're around that are keeping you stuck in those unhelpful patterns. Step two is to inhibit. You have to actively suppress them. A powerful way to do this is by visualizing and letting go of dead past selves, versions of you that no longer serve you. And finally, step three is to flourish. This is where you let the more flexible, creative parts of your brain take over, driving better, more efficient thinking. At the end of the day, it's the ultimate way to minimize that useless extraneous load we talked about.
And all of this brings us to our final and maybe most important takeaway from this whole explainer. This stuff isn't just some abstract theory for teachers or user interface designers. It's a practical blueprint for every single one of us who's just trying to think clearly in this incredibly noisy world. Look, at its heart, understanding cognitive load is about one thing: empowerment. It gives you the words, it gives you the framework to stop being just a passive victim of distraction. It lets you become the active architect of your own focus. You are the designer of your own cognitive ecosystem.
And that brings everything right back to you. Now that you get the difference between good, productive effort and just useless mental clutter, the question isn't theoretical anymore, is it? It's personal. So how are you going to manage your cognitive ecosystem? How will you start pruning that extraneous load from your life to make more room for what actually matters?